On a crisp autumn morning in October 2006, residents of Meadowbrook, a quiet suburb outside Boston, Massachusetts, woke to unsettling news. Patricia Thornton, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher and mother of two, had vanished without a trace. Her husband of 11 years, Daniel Thornton, reported her missing after allegedly returning from a business trip to find their home empty, their children staying with Patricia's mother. She would never leave the kids, Daniel told police, his voice breaking as he sat in the cramped interview room at the Meadowbrook Police Department. Something's happened to her. I know it. Detective Sarah Reeves, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in missing persons cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. From the beginning, something about Daniel's story felt off, subtle inconsistencies in his timeline, emotional responses that seemed rehearsed. But there was nothing concrete, just the nagging instinct that had guided Reeves through dozens of cases before. The first 48 hours are critical in any disappearance, Reeves would later testify. And Mr. Thornton's cooperation seemed performative rather than genuine. The Thornton home, a colonial revival with blue shutters and a well-maintained garden, quickly became the center of an expanding investigation. Neighbors described the Thorntons as the perfect family, Daniel, a successful investment banker, Patricia, a beloved third-grade teacher, and their children Emma and Jack, ages 9 and 7. But as investigators dug deeper, cracks in this perfect facade began to emerge. They fought a lot in the months before she disappeared, revealed Maggie Reynolds, who lived next door to the Thorntons for 8 years. Sometimes I'd hear things breaking. Once I saw Patricia with sunglasses on a cloudy day. When she took them off to wipe her eyes, I noticed bruising. Patricia's sister, Elizabeth Connor, painted an even darker picture when investigators interviewed her. Dan was controlling. Patricia had to account for every dollar she spent. He monitored her phone calls, isolated her from friends. She'd been talking about leaving him. Financial records revealed another troubling dimension. Daniel had recently increased Patricia's life insurance policy to $2 million. Their marriage counselor, breaking confidentiality only after being served with a warrant, confirmed that the couple had been in crisis. Patricia had discovered Daniel's affair with a co-worker and threatened divorce. Despite mounting suspicion, the case remained fundamentally challenging. There was no body, no crime scene, no physical evidence of foul play. Patricia had simply vanished. Until the cadaver dogs arrived at the Thornton property 3 weeks after her disappearance. The German shepherds trained to detect human remains alerted handlers to a section of the garden behind the tool shed, a recently planted rose bed that Daniel claimed to have installed as a surprise for Patricia's birthday the previous month. The soil was different there, noted forensic archaeologist Dr. Martin Chin, who supervised the excavation. Looser, less compacted than the surrounding earth, suggesting recent disturbance to a depth of approximately 6 feet. What investigators discovered beneath the roses sent shockwaves through the community: human remains wrapped in a blue tarp. DNA testing would later confirm these were the remains of Patricia Thornton. The cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. Daniel Thornton was arrested the same day. He didn't even ask why we were taking him in, Detective Reeves recalled. Most innocent people ask questions, demand explanations. He just nodded like he'd been waiting for this day to come. Commonwealth vs. Thornton became one of Massachusetts' most closely watched trials of 2007. Prosecutor Amanda Diaz methodically built her case, presenting evidence that Daniel had purchased the tarp, a shovel and several bags of concrete mix 2 days before Patricia's disappearance, while she was visiting her sister with the children. Cell phone records placed Daniel at home the night Patricia allegedly disappeared, contradicting his claim that he was on a business trip to New York. A neighbor's security camera caught glimpses of Daniel's car in the driveway during the hours he claimed to be hundreds of miles away. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Daniel, facing an expensive divorce that would expose his affair and financial improprieties at work, killed Patricia during an argument, buried her body in the garden, and reported her missing to collect insurance money and avoid losing custody of their children. This was a calculated act of domestic violence at its most extreme, Diaz told the jury during opening statements. Daniel Thornton chose murder over divorce because it was the most financially advantageous option. Defense attorney James Harrington mounted an aggressive defense, challenging the forensic evidence and offering alternative explanations for Daniel's suspicious activities. My client was preparing to build a small pond in the garden, a surprise for his wife and children, Harrington argued, explaining the purchase of materials. The business trip was canceled at the last minute, but rather than return home, Mr. Thornton stayed in a hotel to work on a presentation. He has receipts. The defense's strategy centered on creating reasonable doubt by questioning the reliability of DNA evidence from degraded remains and suggesting that Patricia might have had enemies through her volunteer work with troubled youth. Most significantly, Harrington highlighted inconsistencies in the medical examiner's report. The remains showed signs of advanced decomposition inconsistent with the proposed timeline. Additionally, the skeletal structure exhibited subtle anomalies that didn't fully align with Patricia's medical records. The prosecution has rushed to judgment, Harrington told the jury. They found a body and stopped looking. But science tells us this might not even be Patricia Thornton. After an 8-week trial and 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Daniel Thornton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Thornton case gradually receded from headlines. Daniel maintained his innocence through failed appeals. The children were raised by Patricia's sister, growing up in the shadow of tragedy. The community of Meadowbrook slowly healed, though residents would still point out the murder house to newcomers, despite its renovation and sale to a new family unconnected to the case. For 10 years, the case was considered closed, until an impossible phone call reached Detective Reeves, now a lieutenant nearing retirement. On November 12, 2016, Daniel Thornton, now 48 and serving his 10th year in maximum security prison, received a visitor, a woman who signed in under the name Mary Smith. Prison security footage would later show Daniel's face draining of color when he saw her, his body collapsing back into his chair as though he'd seen a ghost. In a sense, he had. 3 hours later, Lieutenant Sarah Reeves received a call from the prison warden. Mary Smith had left documents proving she was Patricia Thornton, alive, in good health, and demanding to know why her husband was in prison for her murder. "I thought it was a sick joke," Reeves would later tell reporters. "I'd seen Patricia's remains with my own eyes. I'd testified at the trial. The DNA had matched her profile. It was impossible. But the fingerprints matched Patricia's records. Advanced DNA testing confirmed her identity. And facial recognition software gave a 99.7% match to her driver's license photo from 2006. Patricia Thornton, or someone identical to her in every measurable way, had returned from the dead." The investigation that followed uncovered one of the most elaborate disappearance plots in criminal history. Patricia, facing a deteriorating marriage and fearing for her safety, had spent 2 years planning her escape. Through her volunteer work at a women's shelter, she had met Catherine Weber, a terminally ill woman with similar physical characteristics who had no family. Catherine, suffering from late-stage cancer and wanting to give meaning to her death, had agreed to help Patricia escape her abusive marriage. When Catherine died of natural causes, Patricia, who had been secretly siphoning money into an offshore account, paid a corrupt mortuary employee to falsify cremation records. She then strategically planted evidence around her home suggesting domestic violence, knowing that eventually, Catherine's remains would be discovered and mistaken for her own. "I never intended for Daniel to be convicted of murder," Patricia claimed in her statement to investigators. "I thought they'd find the body and declare me dead. I just wanted to disappear with my children, to start over somewhere he couldn't find us." But her plan had gone terribly wrong. Before she could take the children and disappear, police discovered the remains sooner than anticipated. Witnessing the investigation unfold through news reports from her hiding place in Quebec, Canada, Patricia panicked and fled farther, eventually settling in a small town in Portugal under a new identity. "I was afraid to come forward," she explained. "I'd committed multiple felonies. And part of me thought maybe it was better for my children to believe I was dead than to know I'd abandoned them." The revelations turned the Massachusetts criminal justice system upside down. Daniel Thornton was released after serving 10 years for a murder that never occurred. Patricia faced charges including obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, and fraud. The children, now adults, struggled to process the betrayal from both parents, a father who had been abusive and a mother who had abandoned them to be raised by relatives while she built a new life abroad. Prosecutors faced difficult questions about how they had secured a murder conviction with what now appeared to be insufficient evidence. The medical examiner who had identified the remains as Patricia's resigned amid the scandal. Detective Reeves, whose testimony had helped convict Daniel, took early retirement, her confidence in her investigative abilities shattered. "Systems failed at every level," noted legal analyst Michaela Washington. Confirmation bias led investigators to see only evidence that supported their theory. The medical examiner rushed the identification. The jury convicted without absolute certainty. And at the center of it all was a woman so desperate to escape her marriage that she engineered her own death. In an ironic twist, Daniel and Patricia Thornton found themselves sitting on opposite sides of a courtroom once again in 2018, this time with Daniel watching as Patricia was sentenced to 8 years in prison for her elaborate deception. Daniel, who received a $5.7 million settlement from the state for wrongful conviction, moved to Florida and rarely speaks publicly about the case. He has a strained relationship with his children, who have struggled to reconcile the father they remember with the man who spent a decade in prison protesting his innocence. Patricia, from prison, has attempted to reconnect with her now-adult children through letters, most of which remain unanswered. Her motivations continue to be debated. Was she a victim fleeing abuse through the only means she thought available, or a manipulative individual who callously allowed an innocent man to be convicted of murder? The case has prompted reforms in how unidentified remains are processed and the standards required for murder convictions absent a positively identified victim. It has become a cautionary tale taught in forensic science programs in law schools across the country. Perhaps most poignantly, the case raises profound questions about the nature of truth and justice, how easily narrative can be mistaken for fact, how desperately we want to believe in clear villains and victims, and how rarely human behavior conforms to such simple categorizations. As Emma Thornton, now 29, remarked in her only public statement about her parents, "The truth isn't always what's buried in the garden or what walks through the door 10 years later. Sometimes the truth is that there are no heroes in a story, only people who make terrible choices when they feel they have no good options left." Emma and Jack Thornton had built lives defined by absence. For a decade, they had mourned a mother they believed was murdered and visited a father they were told was guilty. The revelation of their mother's elaborate deception shattered not only their understanding of the past but their very sense of identity. "We grew up as the murder victims' kids," Jack, now 25, explained in a rare interview. "Our aunt and uncle were amazing, but that shadow followed us everywhere, at school, in relationships. People looked at us differently. And then suddenly we're supposed to process that our mother chose to abandon us, that she watched from another country as we grieved her death." Emma, who had become a forensic psychologist partly inspired by her family's tragedy, found herself in the surreal position of analyzing her own parents' case from a professional perspective. "Trauma bonding, coercive control, flight response, I can identify all the psychological mechanisms at play," she said. "But understanding intellectually doesn't heal the emotional damage. Every Mother's Day for 10 years, I visited what I thought was my mother's grave. Now those memories feel like a lie." Both children struggled with the complicated truth that their father, while not a murderer, had indeed been abusive. Prison records showed that Daniel had participated in anger management and domestic violence prevention programs during his incarceration, emerging a changed man according to counselors. But for Emma and Jack, reconciliation remained elusive. "He wants us to validate his victimhood," Emma observed. "And yes, he spent a decade in prison for a crime that never happened. But he refuses to acknowledge the behavior that drove our mother to such desperate measures in the first place." From her cell at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Framingham, Patricia Thornton agreed to a series of interviews with investigative journalist Maya Castillo, offering unprecedented insight into the decade she spent as a ghost. After fleeing to Quebec, Patricia had worked as a private English tutor while constantly looking over her shoulder. When news of Daniel's conviction reached her, she was paralyzed by conflicting emotions: relief at her successful escape, guilt over his fate, and agonizing separation from her children. "I convinced myself they were better off," she admitted. "I told myself Elizabeth would raise them with love and stability. I imagined them thriving without the tension they'd lived with. Every birthday, every Christmas, I composed letters I never sent." When Catherine Weber's sister unexpectedly surfaced in 2015, having been estranged for years but now curious about her sister's final days, the careful construction of Patricia's plan began to unravel. Dental records that hadn't been checked in the initial investigation suddenly cast doubt on the identity of the remains. "I could have stayed hidden," Patricia acknowledged. "But I kept thinking about what I was teaching my children by staying away, that running from problems is better than facing them. That deception is an acceptable solution." Her decision to return and reveal herself was triggered by learning that Emma had become engaged. "The thought of my daughter walking down the aisle believing I was dead. I couldn't bear it. If I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison for what I'd done, at least they would know the truth." The Thornton case prompted a comprehensive review of forensic procedures in Massachusetts and eventually nationwide. An independent commission identified multiple points where more rigorous scientific standards might have prevented the wrongful conviction. The rush to judgment was multi-layered, concluded forensic anthropologist Dr. Simone Hawkins, who led the review. The partial skeletal remains were compromised by soil conditions. The DNA testing was conducted on limited samples with technology that's since been surpassed. Most critically, confirmation bias led examiners to interpret ambiguous findings as supporting the prosecution's theory. District Attorney Vincent Pelletier, who had inherited the fallout from his predecessor's prosecution, initiated a review of all murder convictions in the county where identification of remains had been a key factor. 2 additional cases were subsequently reopened. The Thornton case exposed how narrative can drive investigation, Pelletier acknowledged. Once investigators believed Daniel Thornton was guilty, evidence was filtered through that assumption. Alternative explanations were dismissed rather than explored. The legal system's self-examination extended to how domestic abuse allegations are handled. Patricia's claims of abuse, which had been documented in therapy sessions but never reported to police, raised questions about the inadequacy of resources for victims and the sometimes impossible choices they face. Patricia Thornton chose an extraordinary and criminal path, noted domestic violence advocate Renee Washington. But her case forces us to ask, what safer options should have been available to her? How did multiple systems fail to protect her before she felt her only choice was to disappear? The Thornton case became a cultural phenomenon that evolved with each new revelation. Initially portrayed as a tragic domestic murder, the story transformed into a tale of wrongful conviction, then morphed again into an exploration of deception and moral ambiguity. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Lifetime produced a movie titled The Wife Who Wasn't There. Law and Order, SVU aired a thinly veiled fictional version. Online forums debated who deserved more sympathy, Daniel for his wrongful imprisonment or Patricia for her years of abuse. Few commentators acknowledged the possibility that both perspectives could simultaneously be valid, that Daniel could be both victim and perpetrator, that Patricia could be both calculated deceiver and desperate survivor. We want clean narratives with clear heroes and villains, observed cultural critic Jordan Lynn. The Thornton case denies us that comfort. It forces us to hold contradictory truths in tension, which most people find deeply unsettling. This discomfort played out in public opinion polls showing Americans almost evenly split on whether Patricia deserved her prison sentence, with sharp divisions along gender lines. Men were significantly more likely to view her actions as unforgivable, while women were more likely to express understanding of her motivations, if not her methods. In April 2022, Patricia Thornton was released on parole after serving 5 years of her 8-year sentence. She moved into a small apartment in western Massachusetts, taking a job at a nonprofit organization that helps women rebuild their lives after incarceration. Daniel, who had remarried and started a foundation for the wrongfully convicted, maintained his distance both physically and emotionally. His memoir, Buried Alive, My Decade of Injustice, made the New York Times bestseller list but was criticized for minimizing his role in the dysfunctional marriage that preceded Patricia's disappearance. The most significant development came quietly, away from media attention. On a cool evening in October 2023, almost exactly 17 years after Patricia's disappearance, Emma Thornton knocked on her mother's door. The meeting, arranged through Patricia's parole officer, marked the first time mother and daughter had spoken face-to-face since 2006. "I didn't go there for forgiveness or reconciliation," Emma later shared in a support group for adult children of traumatic family separations. "I went for answers, for closure. I went because living with unanswered questions had become more painful than confronting the source of those questions." The conversation lasted 6 hours. No reconciliation was achieved in that single meeting, but a fragile communication channel was established. Jack would take another year before agreeing to meet his mother, and his encounter was briefer, more guarded. In a strange twist of fate, it was Daniel who eventually created space for his children to navigate their relationship with Patricia. During a rare phone call with Emma, he acknowledged what he had denied for years. "I was not the husband or father I should have been. What your mother did was wrong, but I understand now why she felt trapped." Today, the Thornton case is studied in criminology classes and psychology seminars as a perfect storm of domestic dysfunction, institutional failure, and human complexity. It defies categorization as simply a wrongful conviction case or a domestic violence narrative. It stands instead as a testament to how truth, once believed solid as concrete, can shift and transform when viewed from different angles. Patricia Thornton still attends weekly therapy sessions and speaks occasionally at women's shelters about the importance of seeking help through legitimate channels. She acknowledges the damage her choices caused while maintaining they felt like survival at the time. Daniel Thornton continues his advocacy work for prison reform, an unexpected crusader born from personal injustice. He has never publicly admitted to specific acts of abuse but has spoken about toxic patterns in his marriage that he regrets. Emma and Jack have forged their own paths, selective about when and how they engage with either parent. Emma's doctoral dissertation examines intergenerational trauma in families fractured by crime. Jack's work as an emergency room nurse reflects his desire to help others in crisis. The rose garden where Catherine Weber's remains were discovered has long since been replaced with a children's play structure by the home's new owners, unaware of the property's history. In Meadowbrook, the murder house is now just another colonial on a quiet street. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly resolved narrative lies the most disquieting truth of all. Justice is rarely pure or absolute. Sometimes it's a messy compromise between competing harms. Sometimes there is no perfect resolution, only the painful necessity of moving forward with wounds that never fully heal. As Patricia wrote in her final letter to her children before surrendering herself to authorities in 2016, the truth is both simpler and more complicated than anyone wants to believe. I didn't die in that garden. But something did, the belief that problems can be escaped, that running solves anything, that secrets stay buried forever. They don't. They rise. They always rise.